Hey friends, tonight we journey back to the sun-drenched hills and olive groves of ancient Greece, a world where philosophy flourished, democracy dawned, and statues proudly stood without the burden of pants. Yes, really. But behind the gleam of marble columns and names like Plato and Pericles lies a grittier, sweatier truth. Daily life in this golden age was far from comfortable. While ancient Greece may have birthed the ideals of Western civilization, for the average citizen, it delivered a rougher reality, one that most of us wouldn't last a day in. So before we dive into the past, hit that like button if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment to let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. I love watching this story circle grow. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a quiet fan for some gentle background noise. Let's wind down together as we step into the stone-walled homes of another era. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day doesn't begin with an alarm, but with the morning sun baking your roof until your bedroom turns into a makeshift oven. Your house? A humble structure of sun-dried mud bricks or jagged stone, with tiny wooden shuttered windows and no glass. No insulation, no ceiling fans, and certainly no notion of personal space, unless you count the patch of floor the family goat doesn't occupy. You wake early, not from ambition, but because staying horizontal is unbearable. In summer, the walls soak up the heat like dry sponges and release it straight into your bones. Come winter, those same walls turn into an icy tomb, and you're curled in a thin cloth blanket, hoping not to wake up as a popsicle in human form. Your bed? A lumpy straw mat or rough blanket over the floor. No pillows, just your arm or a balled-up cloak. If you made it through the night without getting bitten by lice, consider yourself blessed by the gods. Forget about running water. Your morning begins with a trek, either to the village fountain or, if you live outside the city, a long walk to a nearby well. You haul clay jugs full of water on your shoulders, praying your knees don't buckle and send your spine and sanity shattering across the ground. And bathing? That's a luxury reserved for the end of the day, if ever. You might splash your face, slather on some olive oil to lift the grime, then scrape it all off with a curved metal blade called a strigil. Imagine a spa day, if the spa were run by Spartans. As for privacy? Forget it. You, your parents, your siblings, and maybe a goat all share the same single-room home. You sleep together, eat together, and constantly debate who tracked the most mud inside. The street outside serves as your hallway, your gossip hub, your garbage dump. And you haven't even eaten yet. So, what does breakfast in ancient Greece look like? Let's just say it won't fill your stomach, or your heart. Your first bite is a chunk of masa, a dense, chewy cake made from ground barley and water, cooked on hot stones or leftover ashes. It's like an ancient granola bar, only without sweetness, crunch, or joy. To make it palatable, you might dunk it in diluted wine, because surprise, the local water could make you very sick, very fast. Welcome to breakfast, the driest, dullest way to start your day. And yet, compared to what's ahead, this may be the most peaceful moment you get. There's no fancy filter, no boiling kettle, and definitely no sleek pitcher sitting in your rustic clay pantry. So what do you drink? Everyone, toddlers to elders, gets a sip of wine diluted with water. Not to party. To live. If you're one of the rare lucky ones, maybe breakfast includes a fig, an olive, or a paper-thin smear of goat cheese. But let's face it, you're not lucky. You're grateful if your bread hasn't become a breeding ground for yesterday's flies, and it doesn't crack your molar when you bite in. There's no coffee. No scrambled eggs. No honey-glazed fruits. Unless you happen to know a generous beekeeper and have something decent to trade. And don't expect a relaxing meal. Breakfast is fast. No chairs. No forks. No candlelit mindfulness. You chew. You nod. You move. And if you're a woman, forget sharing the table. In many homes, women and children eat after the men, quietly, and usually what's left. So, not only is the food bad, you also get to wait around for your turn to be disappointed. And the irony? These are the same ancient Greeks who gave us grand banquets, wine-soaked poetry, and decadent symposiums. But breakfast? That didn't even earn a line of verse. It's functional. Dry. Sometimes burnt. But you devour it like a champion, because it's all that stands between you and a blistering day of sun, toil, and arguing philosophers. Bon appetit. Just don't chip a tooth on the crust. Now that you've forced down your brick of stale barley and watered wine, let's talk about freshening up. Or rather, failing to. In ancient Greece, hygiene is less about being clean and more about ritual. And soap? That's still a mythical invention for future generations. A typical bath means cold water splashed over your body at a public fountain or cracked basin. Unless you're blessed enough to live near a proper bathhouse, which most aren't, this is as good as it gets. No shampoo. No refreshing body wash. No loofah unless you've managed to snatch one off a sponge diver from the Aegean. Instead, you rely on olive oil. Yes, oil. You rub it all over your skin, not to moisturize, but to bind to the grime. Then you scrape it off with a curved bronze blade called a strigil. The result? You're a little less greasy, but still highly questionable. Picture this, slathering yourself in salad dressing, and then shaving it off with a butter knife. That's your morning skincare routine. And if you think that sounds elegant, just remember, you're doing this with strangers. Naked. Loudly. Hygiene is a public event. Privacy? That's a modern luxury. Now let's address your smile. Toothbrushes don't exist. Toothpaste? Fantasy. If you're fancy, you might swish with vinegar or rub your gums with crushed charcoal. But more likely, you gnaw on a twig and pray to the gods. Dental care is less about routine and more about divine intervention. As for body odor? It's everywhere. Deodorant isn't a thing. Perfume exists, but it's expensive. If you're lucky, you'll dab some rose oil or myrrh on your neck, right before sweating through 5 dusty miles in your worn-out sandals. The final scent? A signature Greek blend of musk, olive oil, sunburn, and regret. Laundry is rare. Most wash their clothes by pounding them on rocks beside the river. If you're poor, and you probably are, your tunic hasn't touched water since the last temple festival. So no, hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about looking good. It's about looking slightly less horrifying than you did yesterday. The oil and scrape ritual helps, sort of. But it only goes so far when you're stewing in a linen tunic under a sun that seems personally offended by your existence. Yes, ancient Greece gave the world the building blocks of democracy, philosophy, and stunning architecture. But a functioning shower? Still a few centuries out of reach. Once you've scraped off the sleep and some of the sweat, it's time to get dressed, and here comes the comedy. Your wardrobe consists of 2 glorious options, the chiton or the himation. Both are basically large linen rectangles, worn more like ambitious curtains than clothing. You wrap, pin, belt, and hope for the best. There's no tailoring, no seams, no weatherproofing, and absolutely no forgiveness when the wind decides to introduce your personal business to the entire agora. Forget underwear, it hasn't been invented yet. Bras? Also non-existent. So unless you're a Spartan woman who wrestles wild boars for fun, you're spending your day praying that your brooch doesn't betray you mid-step. One tug, and suddenly your entire worldview is hanging by a thread, literally. Footwear? If you're well off, you might own a pair of sturdy leather sandals. If not, you're barefoot. Sun protection? Don't count on it. Hats are for farmers and sailors. Sunscreen doesn't exist because, well, science hasn't quite gotten around to inventing chemistry. The Greek sun is relentless. It doesn't care how many scrolls of Plato you've read. By midday, your shoulders are burnt, your feet are filthy, and your robe is clinging to you in 5 separate dimensions. And let's not forget, public nudity isn't taboo here. You'll stroll past men training completely naked at the gymnasium, orators in barely held together togas giving rousing speeches, and philosophers who clearly believe modesty is a modern disease. Now, if you're rich, your clothes might be dyed, a hint of saffron, maybe some purple. But most people wear bland tones, off-white, faded brown. Dyes are expensive, and nobody's wasting bright colors on the guy who mends fishnets for a living. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't just a job. It's your birthright, your social contract, and often, your fast track to an early funeral. If you're a free male citizen, especially in cities like Athens or Sparta, congrats, you're now part-time philosopher, full-time soldier. By your early teens, you're already swinging wooden weapons and memorizing military drills. You're learning the phalanx, the famous Greek strategy where soldiers pack in shoulder to shoulder with shields so tight, your life depends on your neighbor's balance and bladder control. In Sparta, boys start military training at age 7. It's called the agoge, a brutal, state-run program where survival means being starved, beaten, and isolated until you either emerge a warrior or not at all. In Athens, it's less savage but still compulsory. 2 full years of military education await you in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call for any skirmish that pops up. And no, saying I'm more of a thinker won't save you. Even Socrates fought in battle, and not with words, but with a spear. Everyone fights. There's always a war, Athens versus Sparta, Sparta versus Persia, Persia versus literally everyone, or your city-state versus a neighbor who insulted your olive trade. Peace in ancient Greece isn't a condition. It's just the intermission between battles. As for armor, if your family's got coin, you'll be rocking a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, round hoplon shield, and a solid spear. If you're poor, good luck. You might get a wooden shield and hope the enemy is merciful or short-sighted. Either way, by mid-afternoon, you're a sunburned, hungry, half-dressed soldier in training, marching into the next chore, conflict, or philosophical debate about whether life is suffering. Spoiler alert, it is. Leather and linen won't stop an arrow. And the worst part? You bring your own armor. That's right, being a soldier here is strictly BYOB, bring your own bronze. If you're poor, you either beg, borrow, or charge into battle with whatever you can find, which usually means you're among the first to fall. When you're not fighting, you're preparing to fight. That means endless drills, hours cleaning dull weapons, shouting matches in the assembly over tactics, or rowing warships until your hands bleed. Because, no, those triremes don't row themselves. And when it's all over, there's no medal, no pension, no therapy. Just scars, a limp, and maybe, just maybe, a crooked gravestone carved by someone who barely knew your name, praising your virtue and bravery. Think that's hard? That's just the male experience. Wait until you hear what it's like to be a woman. In most Greek city-states, especially in Athens, women had fewer rights than a broken vase. No voting. No office. No land ownership. You're rarely seen outside your home unless escorted by a male relative. Walk around too freely and rumors swirl. Whispers that you might be a courtesan, or worse, a Spartan. Here's your daily routine. Wake before dawn. Spin wool. Weave cloth. Grind grain. Fetch water. Bake bread. Manage the slaves if your family owns any. Raise the children. You're the CEO of the house, just without the paycheck, recognition, or time off. Your social life? A rumor. You don't attend plays. You don't visit the agora. You definitely don't hang around the gymnasium. That's for oiled-up naked men philosophizing in the sun. You're mostly confined to the gymnasium, the women's quarters, where your view of the world comes filtered through lattice windows. If you're lucky, you learn to read a little. But most of your education revolves around housework and motherhood. Philosophy, geometry, public speaking, that's for the boys. Your path is marriage, childbirth, and silence. Marriage arrives early, sometimes as a young teen, usually to a man twice your age. Love isn't expected. Dowries are. You're a transaction arranged by your father. And once children come, your greatest value is measured by your womb. Now, Spartan women were different, more free, more educated, more public. They trained, they owned land, they spoke their minds. But before you get too envious, remember, their freedom served a single purpose: producing strong warriors for a war-hungry state. If you couldn't give birth to a healthy soldier, you faced disgrace. If your husband died, your rights shrank with your chances of remarriage. You were empowered, but within strict, brutal parameters. So yes, the Greeks worshipped fierce goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hestia. But real-life women? They were expected to stay silent, stay inside, and stay unseen. And then there's democracy. Ancient Athens gets all the credit as the birthplace of democracy, and technically that's true. But slow down before you celebrate. You likely wouldn't qualify. To vote in the Athenian assembly, you had to be male, born to Athenian parents, and at least 18. Which means women, immigrants, called medics, slaves, and children, almost 90% of the population, had no political voice at all. That's not government by the people. That's government by a very specific, very exclusive club of sunburned men in sandals. If you did meet the criteria, though, your civic duty didn't end with casting a vote. No, you were expected to show up regularly, to debate, vote, and pass laws in open-air assemblies that often gathered thousands of citizens. Democracy here wasn't a luxury. It was a full-time job. In ancient Athens, there were no career politicians in suits rehearsing speeches. Every eligible man was a part-time legislator, part-time juror, and full-time overconfident amateur. You could be randomly selected, yes, randomly, to oversee vital institutions, from managing the treasury to serving on a jury, through what essentially amounted to a political lottery. Sounds exciting, right? Until you realize qualifications didn't exist. Your local fishmonger might be in charge of military supply chains by Thursday. And your uncle, the one who swears he saw a sea monster on vacation, could be judging a murder trial come Friday. And if someone got too powerful? Too charismatic? Or maybe just had the audacity to win too many debates? The answer wasn't a stern letter. It was ostracism, a public exile by popular vote. Once a year, citizens would scratch names onto broken shards of pottery called ostraca, and, with enough votes, that person would be banished for 10 years. No trial. No appeal. Just a congrats, you're too popular, please pack your things. Yet for all its chaos and contradiction, Athenian democracy was a revolutionary idea. It gave common men, well, some common men, a chance to have a voice in shaping society. And it planted the seeds for many of the political structures we rely on today. But let's be clear, it wasn't just flawed. It was deeply exclusive. If you were a woman? Silenced. A foreign-born taxpayer? Silenced. A slave building the Parthenon with bloodied hands? Absolutely silenced. If you were a philosopher who questioned too many sacred cows? There was a decent chance you'd be handed a cup of hemlock and told to stop asking so many questions. Democracy may have been born in Athens, but if you showed up expecting equality, you'd be tossed out of the assembly faster than you could spell ostrakhan. Now let's talk about slavery, not as a dark corner of society, but as its very foundation. In ancient Greece, slavery wasn't just accepted. It was expected. Even modest households owned at least one slave, not because they were wealthy, but because owning another human being was as ordinary as owning sandals or a water jug. The idea that someone shouldn't be a slave was nearly unthinkable. Slaves came from all over: Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and fellow Greeks captured during war. Some were born into it. Others were kidnapped or sold. It was a brutal economy, and business was always tragically booming. In Athens, slaves did everything. They cooked meals, hauled water, cleaned houses, watched over children, ran errands, and stood quietly in the background at dinner like invisible furniture. Some were trusted with business transactions or managed entire households, while their owners debated ethics at drunken symposiums, reclining on pillows, drinking wine diluted with water, and musing about the nature of freedom. Irony level, maximum. Meanwhile, in the silver mines of Laurion, slaves, including children, worked in absolute darkness, crawling through narrow tunnels, choking on dust, and slowly dying so Athens could mint coins and build monuments. And yes, some slaves were educated. They taught children, kept financial records, and even worked in banks. But don't let that fool you. No matter how intelligent or skilled, they were still considered property. They could be beaten, sold, or killed at their owner's whim, and had no legal standing to object. Even those who were freed, the freedmen, weren't really free. They still owed loyalty to their former masters and were barred from full citizenship. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own land. They were stuck in a limbo, not slaves, but never equals. And unlike later eras, there was no great moral awakening, no abolitionist movement marching for change. In ancient Greece, the institution of slavery was as foundational, and unquestioned, as the columns holding up the temples. It was, to them, simply the way the world worked. Philosophers like Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle, argued that slavery was not only acceptable, but natural. According to him, some people were born to rule, and others to obey. Enlightening, isn't it? Ancient Greece gave the world ethics, democracy, and high-minded philosophy, but all of it was built atop the backs of those who were never allowed to speak, never allowed to vote, and never allowed to matter. That's not a side note, it's the very cornerstone. Feeling unwell in ancient Greece? That's unfortunate, because unless you lived next door to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare plan involved a handful of herbs, an offering to the gods, and a large dose of hope. Let's start with the basics. There are no hospitals. If you're sick or injured, you stay home. Maybe your neighbor knows how to make a poultice. Maybe a cousin remembers a prayer to Asclepius, god of healing. Maybe your local temple has a sacred snake you can pet for comfort. That's about the extent of it. The most respected doctors were part healer, part philosopher, and part gambler. They believed your body was ruled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness? That's just your fluids out of balance. Too much blood? Time to let some out. Persistent cough? That's excess phlegm. Try fasting. Sad and withdrawn? Clearly your black bile's acting up. Best to take a stroll and stare at the sea. Treatments were a mix of trial, error, and desperation. Crushed poppy seeds, boiled figs, vinegar compresses, or something weird and sticky scraped off a goat. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery? Rare. And terrifying. There's no anesthesia, no antiseptics. A simple cut could turn septic, Surgical tools? Iron knives, bone saws, and blind faith. If you needed something amputated, you'd better bring a leather strap to bite and someone strong to hold you down. Midwives handled childbirth, which was dangerous even on a good day. Mortality rates for mothers and infants were tragically high. One wrong angle. One stuck shoulder. One breeched baby, and that was it. If you had money, you might summon a traveling physician, someone with scrolls and oils who spoke in confident tones. But if you were poor, you leaned on local wisdom, home remedies, and resilience. Or, you simply didn't survive. Still, it wasn't all bad. They did believe in rest, clean air, and eating well. So there's that. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath. It also gave us treatments like drinking cabbage water or slathering wounds with mashed garlic. So yes, healthcare in ancient Greece? Mostly herbs, hope, and holding on. Now let's talk theater. In ancient Greece, drama wasn't just entertainment. It was sacred. It was civic. It was emotional hand-to-hand combat for the soul. Here's the good news: theater was free for citizens. That is, unless you were a woman, a slave, or a foreigner. Then tough luck. But if you were eligible, you'd find yourself packed into an enormous stone amphitheater carved into a hillside. Like the Grand Theater of Dionysus in Athens. Shoulder to shoulder with thousands of sweaty fellow citizens. And you weren't just there for an hour. You were there all day. The Dionysia festival ran from dawn until dusk. Back-to-back performances, tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays. No intermissions. No snacks. And no convenient bathrooms, unless you counted the bushes lining the hill. Show up late? Get rowdy? You wouldn't just be scolded. You could be fined on the spot. The plays themselves? Intense. The tragedies were emotional wrecking balls. Betrayal. Madness. Murder. Gods punishing mortals for mistakes made generations ago. These weren't stories designed to make you laugh. They were written to make you feel, deeply, together. You didn't go to theater to be entertained. You went to be transformed. Then came the comedies. Though not exactly the kind you'd watch with your grandparents after dinner. These were bold, raunchy, razor-sharp performances that skewered everything from politicians to philosophers, entire city-states, and even bodily functions. Picture if Saturday Night Live had a child with a university philosophy club, dressed it in an absurdly oversized phallic costume, and shoved it on stage. That's Greek comedy. Actors donned towering masks, clunky platform shoes, and outfits that looked like mythology met Mardi Gras. Every role was played by men, yes, even the women, because gender equality didn't extend to the stage. The chorus? They were the ancient equivalent of a live tweet storm, singing, dancing, and yelling their opinions from the wings like an ancient version of social media, only with more choreography and fewer filters. And the audience? They didn't just sit quietly and clap politely. Oh no. They booed, heckled, threw objects, argued mid-performance, and turned the entire theater into a live-action feedback loop. Theater in ancient Greece wasn't a show. It was democracy with a spotlight. If the play offended you, you shouted. If it moved you, you cried. If it bored you, you hurled olives. At the end of the multi-day festival, a jury would vote to crown the best playwright. You could spend 3 days emotionally wrecked by a tragic masterpiece like Orestes, only to watch a bawdy farce starring a talking pig god walk away with the prize. That's Athens for you. So, you've made it through the emotional roller coaster of ancient tragedy and comedy. You stumble out into the sun, exhausted and inspired, and wander into the agora, the buzzing civic center of the city. There, standing barefoot in a tattered cloak, is a bearded man asking strangers, "What is justice?" Congratulations. you've walked straight into a philosophy trap. In ancient Greece, particularly Athens, philosophy wasn't a quiet hobby or an academic luxury. It was the local blood sport. And the top athletes? Names that now echo through history: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Back then, though, they were just eccentric men who hung around public spaces, asked uncomfortable questions, and made everyone feel like intellectual toddlers. Take Socrates. His life's work consisted of asking questions that went in circles and slowly unraveling people's confidence in their beliefs. You could be buying olives, petting a goat, and suddenly he'd appear beside you. Do you believe in truth? Sure. But what is truth? 3 hours later, you're rethinking your existence and Googling the fastest way to move to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. That job fell to his student, Plato. But Socrates left such an impact that Athens eventually sentenced him to death. Officially, for corrupting the youth and not respecting the gods. Unofficially, for being that guy who never stopped asking questions at dinner parties. Philosophy in Athens was loud, spontaneous, and surprisingly aggressive. Debates happened in the streets, in the marketplace, anywhere there were people to provoke. No microphones. No moderators. Just voices, flailing hands, and more ego than the Parthenon could contain. And if you thought being a bystander kept you safe? Think again. Philosophers loved dragging innocent passers-by into their verbal gladiator matches. Walk near Plato's academy, and you didn't just pass by, you were absorbed. Even children weren't spared. Aristotle personally tutored Alexander the Great, who, after graduation, promptly conquered half the known world. Imagine your civics teacher handing you a sword and a map and saying, "Go reorganize this." So yes, philosophy gave us logic, science, ethics, political theory, and a legacy of intellectual pursuit. But in ancient Athens, it also gave you a high risk of spontaneous identity crisis, public embarrassment, and the unshakable suspicion that you were never as smart as you thought. But in ancient Greece, popularity came with a price. It could earn you admiration, identity crises, and a solid chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in a toga and sandals. So let's say you've made it in Athens. You're eloquent, sharp, politically active. The people know your name, and maybe like you a little too much. That's your first mistake. Because in this city, being too admired might earn you a 10-year vacation. Not a reward. A punishment. Not a jail sentence. A full-blown exile. This wasn't some shady backroom plot. It was part of the system. It was called ostracism, an annual, state-approved game of who should leave Athens this year. Entirely legal. Entirely public. Entirely terrifying. Here's how it worked. Once a year, the citizens gathered to decide whether they even wanted to hold an ostracism vote. If enough people said yes, they moved on to phase 2, writing down the name of one unfortunate soul on a shard of pottery called an ostracon. If your name showed up 6,000 times or more, pack your sandals. You were out. No trial. No defense. No charges. Just gone. And you didn't even have to commit a crime. In fact, most ostracized folks hadn't done anything wrong, except become too powerful, too persuasive, or just annoyingly good-looking. Maybe you were a war hero, a brilliant orator, or had hair that blew just right in the Athenian breeze. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a little too influential. And in the name of democracy, they voted you into a 10-year timeout. Here's the twist: it wasn't forever. After a decade, you could return, no questions asked. Your house untouched. Your citizenship intact. No grudges held. It was like the world's worst all-expenses-paid sabbatical. And it happened to the best of them. Aristides the Just was so famous for his fairness that one man voted to exile him just because he was sick of hearing how noble he was. Savage. Even Themistocles, the man who helped save Athens at the Battle of Salamis, was eventually ousted for getting too confident. Apparently, in Athens, even gratitude had a shelf life. Ostracism was designed to prevent tyranny. But more often, it punished success. If you had ambition, you had to thread a needle, respected, but not too respected. Popular, but not threatening. Think of it like a political reality show. If you won too many hearts, you were voted off the island. With your dignity and your olive oil collection. Athens gave birth to democracy, but it also, arguably, invented cancel culture. 2,500 years ahead of schedule. And then there was death. In ancient Greece, you didn't ask if you'd die young. You wondered how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy hovered somewhere between 30 and 35, if you made it out of childhood. Which many didn't. 1 in 3 children didn't survive past their early years, thanks to malnutrition, disease, and hygiene that was more philosophy than practice. You could die from anything. A scratch that turned septic. A fever that no one understood. Childbirth, which was one of the leading causes of death for women. Or simply drinking the wrong cup of water. Medicine was primitive, and the gods? Inconsistent. If you lived in a city, your odds weren't great. Crowded homes, open drains, shared fountains, perfect conditions for outbreaks. And when disease hit, it hit hard. The infamous plague of Athens struck during the Peloponnesian War, wiping out about a third of the city. Thucydides, the historian who chronicled it, caught the plague himself, and somehow survived to tell the tale. Most people weren't so fortunate. War was constant, and if you were a man in ancient Greece, odds were high that you'd meet your end gripping a spear or rowing until your lungs gave out. Even if you managed to avoid dying in battle, the aftermath wasn't much kinder. Wounds got infected. Fever set in. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and no skilled surgeons, just herbal compresses, garlic poultices, and a whole lot of prayer. And then there were the gods. Forget to make a sacrifice, disrespect a statue, mock a myth after a few cups of wine, and you could find yourself flattened by a thunderbolt, struck with plague, or trampled by an angry herd of goats. Divine wrath came in all shapes, and rarely with a warning label. Burial was everything. If your family couldn't afford the proper funeral, complete with coins for the ferryman, chants, and purification rituals, you might end up dumped outside the city walls, nameless and exposed. Not just undignified, but spiritually dangerous. To the Greeks, an unburied soul was doomed to wander forever, stuck between worlds, never quite dead, never fully at rest. Death didn't care about your beauty, your poetry, or your battlefield record. It came for everyone: slaves, generals, philosophers. You could die from a festering wound, a spoiled fig, or the bite of a mosquito having a particularly bad day. The Greeks had 12 Olympians, and not a single one of them was rooting for you. In theory, Greek religion was about balance and reverence. Worship Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, Artemis, and the rest of that glittering, golden crew up on Mount Olympus. But in reality, religion was less about serenity and more about survival. It was spiritual crisis management 24/7. These weren't gentle, loving gods. They were divine celebrities with short tempers and infinite power. Skip a sacrifice? Expect your harvest to fail. Mispronounce a prayer? There goes your ship. Wander into the wrong grove? That's a snake bite, a plague, or a famine. Pick your curse. The gods didn't just want your belief. They wanted choreography. Perfect timing. Flawless rituals. Daily devotion. Religion wasn't something you did once a week. It was a full-time job. You had household shrines, citywide festivals, seasonal offerings, and specific ceremonies for almost everything. Sowing barley? Pray to Demeter. Going to war? Make offerings to Ares. Maybe double up if you're feeling nervous. Sailing somewhere? Pour a little wine for Poseidon. And maybe toss in a goat, just to be safe. Each god had their favorites, and their vendettas. Apollo might shield your city, unless your ancestor insulted him 3 generations ago. Hera was the goddess of marriage, but she was also the queen of grudges, especially toward mortal women who caught Zeus's wandering eye. Athena, brilliant and wise, once turned a woman into a spider for daring to weave too well. Fair? Not particularly. But divine justice rarely was. And just when you thought you'd figured it out, you remembered the others, the background cast of chaos: nymphs, satyrs, dryads, river spirits, underworld demons. Monsters, curses, ancient ghosts. Step on the wrong patch of sacred ground and suddenly, your left arm belongs to a spiteful tree spirit with boundary issues. But the most maddening part? You never really knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong incense? The wrong hour? Did you offend a god in your dream? Was it your cousin's fault? Or maybe your great-grandfather's bad decision finally caught up with you? It didn't matter. The gods had long memories. And in ancient Greece, even your most careful rituals were never quite enough to guarantee peace. The best you could do was stay vigilant, stay reverent, and hope you weren't next on Mount Olympus' celestial hit list. The gods, in ancient Greece, moved in ways that were mysterious and painfully personal. Yet, for all their wrath, religion wasn't a sideshow. It was the thread that held every part of life together. From the way you governed, to how you gave birth, to who won the javelin toss at the Olympics, the gods were there, watching, judging, occasionally destroying. You feared them, yes. But more than that, you needed them. Their temples rose like beacons across the city skyline. Their festivals shut down entire towns. Their myths explained everything from sudden storms to unexpected heartbreaks. Belief wasn't just about faith, it was survival instinct dressed in olive branches and incense smoke. So after the long, sun-baked days, after barley bread breakfasts, blistered feet in sandals, war drills, plagues, unpredictable deities, and the occasional goat-related incident, it's time to ask the real question. Would you survive a single day in ancient Greece? Let's be honest. No. You'd tap out before lunchtime. The relentless sun, the austere food, the possibility of divine retribution every time you sneezed or stubbed your toe. It would all wipe the romantic toga fantasy right off your face. You're not ready to haul water before dawn. You're not mentally prepared to squat over a dirt hole next to a sacrificial goat. You'd miss plumbing. You'd miss Tylenol. You'd miss the luxury of complaining on the internet without being exiled by a shard of pottery with your name on it. Sure, you like the idea of Athens. The statues. The philosophers. The poets. But those were the elite. The famous 1%. The rest? They were hauling stones, dying young, and hoping the gods weren't in a bad mood. Democracy? Only if you were a man. Medicine? Garlic and guesswork. Divine favor? Unpredictable at best. And your version of social media? A man shouting about justice in the market while holding a fish. And yet, for all of that, they endured. The Greeks didn't just survive hardship. They built civilization inside it. They raised temples that still defy time, wrote plays we still perform, asked questions we're still asking, and laid foundations for everything from astronomy to ethics. They didn't wait for life to get easier. They made meaning in the middle of chaos. They argued, created, suffered, built, and died, and somehow gave birth to a world we still walk through today. No, you wouldn't last. Not at first. The sunstroke, the goat bite, the surprise philosophy lecture in the street, it'd break you. But if you did survive, if you adapted, listened, and made peace with the smell of sweat and roasted onions, you'd find yourself among a people who were passionate, persistent, deeply flawed, and absolutely unforgettable. And they wouldn't mock your struggle. They'd hand you a linen tunic, point toward the amphory, and say, "Good. Now carry that up the hill." It began with a death. And a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe, an eastern corner of what is now England, had learned to walk Rome's tightrope. He ruled not as a rebel, but as a client king, loyal enough to avoid destruction, clever enough to stay useful. His kingdom enjoyed wealth, autonomy, a tense kind of peace. But when he died around 60 AD, he left behind a will, one meant to protect his legacy and his daughters. He named the Roman emperor as coheir alongside his two girls, hoping this carefully crafted gesture would secure their safety and sovereignty. It didn't. Rome didn't compromise. Rome didn't honor. Rome took. Without hesitation, Rome seized the Iceni kingdom. No debate, no diplomacy, just brute force. Their legions marched in and claimed everything: fertile lands, livestock, homes, and hoarded treasures. But the theft of wealth wasn't the true cruelty. What followed wasn't conquest. It was calculated humiliation. In full view of her people, Queen Boudica was whipped, beaten not only to break her body, but to crush her spirit. The Romans weren't just delivering punishment. They were sending a message: you are nothing. And if that cruelty weren't enough, they defiled her daughters. A barbaric spectacle designed to scar a nation into silence. It wasn't just an act of repression. It was psychological warfare, a wound carved into the heart of a culture. But Boudica did not break. She didn't crumble. She transformed. Rome thought they had stamped out a minor provincial queen. Instead, they awakened a lioness. A leader who would forge pain into purpose. A mother who would turn fury into fire. A warrior whose vengeance would leave cities in ash and empires shaken. News of the outrage rippled across Britannia like thunder. Tribe after tribe heard what had happened. And as the stories spread, so did their own buried rage. Their own stolen lands. Their own sons sacrificed on foreign battlefields. Rome had always assumed the tribes were too scattered, too fractured to rise. But now, they shared one thing: Boudica's fury. What began as one woman's punishment would unravel into an empire's nightmare. Rome hadn't just broken a treaty, they had shattered an illusion that their control in Britannia was absolute. It was not. And this was the spark that would ignite one of the most ferocious uprisings Rome would ever face. If they thought Boudica would vanish quietly into the mist, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. She wasn't born to obey. She was born to fight. Even Roman historians, rarely generous with their enemies, couldn't ignore her presence. They described her as tall, unflinching, with fiery red hair tumbling to her waist and a voice that cut through crowds like steel through bone. She was no longer just a ruler. She was a symbol. And more than that, a threat. But before she became a nightmare for Rome, she became something deeper, a mother with nothing left to lose. Roman violence had tried to erase her dignity, her legacy, her children's future. But she refused to be erased. She understood what the Romans feared most wasn't an army. It was unity. And that's what she began to build, tribe by tribe. She started with the Trinovans. Once powerful, now broken under Roman taxes, land seizures, and forced labor. But when Boudica spoke, she didn't speak like a politician. She spoke like a mother wounded, a warrior rising. She reminded them of their ancient gods, their fallen kin, their stolen soil. Her scars were their scars. Her rage was theirs too. Others began to listen. The Corieltovi, the Cornovii, even some of the proud Brigantes. What began as revenge became a crusade, to drive the arrogance of Rome back into the sea. She didn't offer promises of peace. She offered fire. She offered glory. She promised death with honor, if that was what it took. And they followed her, not because she ordered them, but because she rode with them. Not behind the lines, but at the front, spear in hand, hair wild in the wind, eyes blazing toward the future. She called out the names of the violated, the enslaved, the slaughtered. She invoked the gods of their ancestors, especially Andraste, the fierce war goddess, calling her to witness. And her warriors believed, not in strategies or tactics, but in her. Boudica had no military academy training, no scrolls filled with Roman maneuvers. But what she carried was sharper than steel, righteous rage, hardened by betrayal, guided by a cause. And the land seemed to awaken around her. This wasn't a rebellion. This was resurrection. The queen Rome thought it had broken was now the lightning rod for a storm the empire never saw coming. And she was just getting started. The Roman eagle had long ruled the skies over Britannia, its wings casting a shadow of fear and submission. But now the wind was shifting. Boudica's rage wasn't a random blaze. It was a tempest gathering strength with terrifying precision. And every storm needs fuel. Hers came from thousands, no, generations, of Britons who had waited for someone to rise. Someone who would speak not in Latin decrees, but in fire, blood, and iron. Boudica became that voice. It began beneath ancient oaks, under sacred moonlit groves where war councils were held by torchlight. Boudica didn't sit upon a jeweled throne. She stood barefoot in the soil beside her people, listening. Listening to the fury of tribal elders, the grief of mothers, and the cryptic chants of druids who read omens in the stars. They all spoke one truth. Rome had taken too much. Now, it was time to take back. The Trinovans came first, bringing spears and ancient battle songs. The Iceni, Boudica's own, added cavalry, wild-haired riders painted in woad, who moved like shadows across the hills. More tribes followed, bearing axes, blades, torches. Even women, stirred by the courage of their queen, lifted weapons and joined the charge. This was no mere rebellion. This was a resurrection. A revival of a Celtic spirit Rome had tried to crush. But the empire was not easily rattled. Its legions were trained, armored, ruthless. Veterans of 100 wars. Boudica could not match them in equipment. So she turned to what Rome could never command: unity, the land, and a hatred that had been simmering since the first Roman footstep. Hatred sharpened by humiliation. Soon her force grew into a vast tide, tens of thousands. Farmers became warriors. Hunters became assassins. Even former Roman slaves, once broken under the lash, now marched beside her. These fighters didn't serve for coin. They fought for memory, for vengeance, and for a world where their children would never know chains. And then she spoke. Her first speech, one of many to come, was recorded, though filtered through Roman pens. Still, the spirit of her words endures. She promised victory or death. No surrender. No submission. Only forward. Her first target, Camulodunum. Once a sacred site of the Britons, now a Roman colony draped in marble and arrogance. Temples to foreign gods. Villas built over ancient earth. And at its center, the Temple of Claudius, a monument to the emperor who had brought them to their knees. To Boudica and her army, it wasn't sacred. It was a scar. And it would be the first to bleed. The rebellion was no longer a whisper in the woods. It was thunder on the march. And the queen who Rome had mocked now led an unstoppable tide straight toward its stone gates. Camulodunum never had a chance. Where once stood Latin commands and marble columns, there now surged fire and vengeance. The streets that had once echoed with imperial footsteps now trembled beneath tribal war cries. That temple, built with the sweat of slaves to glorify a distant conqueror, became the symbol of everything her people had suffered. Rome saw it as a monument. Boudica saw it as a target. She gave the order. What followed wasn't a battle. It was retribution. A reckoning. Her warriors crashed down like a tidal wave, furious, primal, and righteous. And Camulodunum became the first city to fall. Roman settlers, many of them retired soldiers who had spent years extorting, taxing, and terrorizing the local tribes, never saw it coming. The city of Camulodunum wasn't fortified. No strong walls. No defense plan. Just scattered soldiers who had grown complacent, expecting taxes and tribute, not war. They tried to hold their sacred temple, barricading themselves inside its marble walls, clinging to the hope that it would hold under siege. It didn't. Within 2 days, Boudica's forces shattered their illusion. They stormed in, and the streets ran red with vengeance. No one was spared. Men, women, and children alike were slaughtered without hesitation. This wasn't just a battle, it was personal. Her warriors didn't just fight Roman soldiers. They hunted down symbols of occupation. Statues were toppled and smashed. Roman villas were set ablaze. The temple, once a gleaming monument to imperial dominance, collapsed in a roaring inferno, flames rising like judgment to the sky. Survivors were rare. Those who did escape carried stories soaked in horror, tales that made even hardened Roman blood turn cold. The violence wasn't random. It was focused, it was righteous, and it was long overdue. These were people who had seen their gods mocked, their daughters enslaved, their homes seized like spoils of war. Now they were reclaiming it all, with interest. Panic gripped the Roman officials who managed to survive. Desperate messages were sent to Governor Suetonius, who was hundreds of miles away in western Wales, already dealing with another rebellion. But by the time the pleas reached him, Camulodunum was gone, reduced to ruins and ash, its proud colony wiped from the map. But Boudica didn't pause to celebrate. There was no time. She knew Rome would strike back, and hard. So she moved. Fast. Each city that fell was another blow to the empire's grip. Her next target was bigger. Wealthier. Even more exposed. Londinium. If Rome hadn't taken her seriously yet, they would now. Camulodunum was the match. Londinium would be the blaze. The heart of Roman Britannia, bustling, booming, and utterly unprepared. In just 17 years, Londinium had grown into a jewel of the province. A thriving hub where traders bartered silks and spices, where governors ruled from tiled halls, where coins clinked like water through marble markets. But now, wealth became fear. Suetonius rushed back from Wales with a small contingent of troops, arriving just ahead of the advancing rebels. He looked at the city, crowded, sprawling, defenseless, and made a brutal calculation: Londinium could not be saved. With too few soldiers and no reinforcements in sight, he made the only choice he believed possible: he abandoned it. He ordered an evacuation, taking with him those who could move quickly. But many couldn't. The old, the sick, the stubborn. Those who refused to believe that a woman could lead an army capable of toppling Rome's power. They stayed. And they would pay. Boudica's warriors descended on Londinium like a thunderstorm of wrath. There were no walls to climb, no gates to break through. The city lay wide open. And she made it bleed. Her army poured through the streets with the fury of a generation betrayed. They weren't there to loot. They weren't there to rule. They were there to destroy. Every street became a graveyard. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes and slaughtered. Entire families executed on the spot. Some victims were impaled. Others burned alive within the temples they had once believed sacred. This wasn't conquest. It was retribution. No mercy was shown. No Roman emblem was spared. Villas went up in flames. Granaries ignited like dry tinder. The columns of smoke stretched high into the British sky, black, choking, visible for miles. This wasn't just destruction. It was a message. Rome is not untouchable. Contemporary Roman sources like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimate that tens of thousands died. Some accounts suggest the brutality surpassed even the horror that had unfolded at Camulodunum. To the Roman mind, this wasn't rebellion, it was a full-blown apocalypse. And at the heart of it all rode Boudica. She didn't command from a distance or hide behind war councils. She stood at the front, chariot wheels slicing through the dirt, flanked by her daughters. From there, she watched as Roman pride turned to rubble. This wasn't senseless destruction. To her, it was righteous justice, for her family, her tribe, her land. And she was far from finished. Ahead lay another Roman settlement, Verulamium. And beyond that, the storm she knew was coming, Rome's full retaliation. Rome had seen rebellions. It had put down countless uprisings across continents. But it had never faced anything quite like her. Boudica wasn't a trained tactician. She didn't wear the polished armor of a centurion. She didn't speak Latin. But she had done what no enemy before her had managed, burned 2 Roman cities to the ground and cut down thousands, soldiers and civilians alike. And now, Verulamium, a wealthy, thoroughly Romanized town northwest of Londinium, was next. And it burned. Word of her rampage raced across the empire. Panic seeped into the Roman Senate. Even Emperor Nero reportedly considered abandoning Britannia entirely. Imagine that, an empire stretching from the sun-scorched sands of Africa to the frozen peaks of Germania, shaken to its core by a single woman with a chariot and a cause. That was her power. Not just her army, but what she symbolized. Rome thought itself eternal. Its cities indestructible. Its rule inevitable. But now a Celtic queen, once beaten, bound, and humiliated, was torching that illusion to the ground. Every city she razed wasn't just a battlefield victory. It was psychological warfare. A humiliation no marble forum could explain away. Verulamium followed the path of Camulodunum and Londinium. Grand, rich, Roman, and utterly defenseless. Boudica's warriors swept through, slaughtering residents, destroying temples, and tearing down every Roman-built structure they could find. Even today, archaeological digs beneath modern Verulamium reveal a thick blackened layer of ash, the mark of a fire so fierce, it burned into the very bones of the earth. But with every triumph came a new challenge. Her army grew massive, but her supply lines thinned. The unity that had once driven the tribes began to splinter. Flush with victory, some warriors grew reckless. Strategy gave way to celebration. And Rome, the eternal, calculating Rome, was quietly recovering. Governor Suetonius had not surrendered. He had retreated, but not to yield. He regrouped. He summoned reinforcements, battle-hardened legions drawn from across Britannia. He chose his ground carefully. He studied the terrain. He prepared. Because he knew the final confrontation was coming. And he intended to end it with a single, decisive strike. Even as Rome regrouped, and its military strength returned, one shadow lingered in the hearts of its soldiers. Could they stop her? Because Boudica wasn't just leading a revolt, she was dismantling the myth of Roman invincibility. City after city, fire after fire, she proved the unthinkable, that an empire could bleed, and a queen could make it scream. The final confrontation loomed. The rebellion had burned as far as it could. Now, flame would meet iron. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus had chosen his battlefield with ruthless precision. He wasn't just another Roman bureaucrat, he was a hardened survivor. While Boudicca's forces celebrated victories, Suetonius was planning retribution. He selected a narrow pass, surrounded by woods and ridges, where Boudicca's vast numbers would count for nothing. A killing box. His force was small, no more than 10,000 men, but they were veterans. Disciplined, armored, drilled to perfection. Each man a weapon. Boudicca's force was massive. Some accounts claim as many as 200,000 followed her banner. But they were not trained soldiers. They were blacksmiths, farmers, tribal warriors, and freedom seekers. Their weapon was fury. Their fuel was pain. But their formation was chaos. They believed sheer numbers would drown the Roman line. They were wrong. As her army assembled, Boudicca climbed onto her war chariot, her daughters beside her. She raised her voice like a drumbeat across the field. She didn't speak of conquest, she spoke of wounds. Of the beatings. The rapes. The children taken. The lands stolen. She invoked the war goddess Andraste. She called to the ancestors. And she vowed victory or death. Her army roared in response. They believed the gods would fight with them. And then they charged. The Britons filled the field like a storm. A thunder of feet and war cries. But Suetonius didn't flinch. He waited. Let them press into the choke point, tight, disorganized, trapped. Then he gave the order. The Roman counterstrike came like clockwork. Javelins flew in lethal arcs. Shields locked. Gladius blades struck with surgical brutality. It wasn't a battle. It was a dissection. Wave after wave of Britons slammed into Roman steel, and each time, they shattered. Then the legions advanced. One step at a time. Unyielding. Precise. Pitiless. Behind Boudicca's army were their wagons, families, children, spectators who had come to witness Roman defeat. But instead, they became a wall. The Britons couldn't retreat. Trapped, panic spread like wildfire. The field became a blood-soaked funnel of death. When the dust settled, it was over. Tens of thousands of Britons lay slain. The rebellion was crushed. Rome had been rocked, but not toppled. Boudicca had poured everything into the fight. And though she lost the battle, her defiance would echo longer than the clash of swords. Her fate remains cloaked in mystery. No one knows what became of her. There was no captured queen paraded through Roman streets. No public execution. No final humiliation. She vanished. Roman historians offer different endings. Some say she took poison, refusing to let the empire claim her. Others whisper that she fell ill and died quietly, her body carried away by those who loved her. But all sources agree on this. She disappeared, like a wildfire fading into ash. And in doing so, she became more than a queen. She became legend. The battlefield fell silent. The roar of war replaced by the weeping of the dying. Boudicca had lost not only a battle, but a revolution born of her own pain. The earth was soaked with the blood of her people, and their shattered dreams drifted on the cold Britannic wind. Yet no tomb was ever found. No grave marked her passing. Because Boudicca's final act wasn't to fall. It was to endure. And in that silence, she ceased to be just a woman. She became myth. Rome, shaken and humiliated by the scale of her uprising, tried to erase the memory. But it was far too late. Boudicca had become something far greater than a name. She was a legend sung in tribal songs, her story whispered beneath sacred trees. To the Britons, she wasn't a failed rebel. She was a martyr. A war goddess cloaked in vengeance. A mother who had stood up to the most powerful empire on earth, and made it bleed. Even among Romans, a grudging respect lingered. Tacitus, a Roman through and through, didn't portray her as a barbarian, but as a leader wronged by arrogance and empire. Cassius Dio spoke of her presence, commanding, fierce, unshakable. They feared her. And yet they admired the iron will that drove her. Across the centuries, Boudica refused to vanish. She would rise again, in Victorian bronze, in Tennyson's verses, in schoolbook margins, and in the hearts of women who saw in her story something immortal. Her chariot, with spiked wheels tearing through history, became more than a weapon. It became a symbol. A warning. A promise. And though her body may be lost to time, her voice never faded. It travels on the wind. It roars in every fire. It speaks in the quiet breath of anyone who has stood before injustice and whispered, "I will not kneel." Centuries have passed since Boudica vanished into the mist of history. And yet, her shadow still falls across the British Isles. Her name is etched into monuments, echoed in parliamentary speeches, felt in the grit of a people who, to this day, have never truly forgotten her. In London, near Westminster Bridge, she stands in bronze, tall, unyielding, her daughters beside her, her chariot raised high, eyes locked on the horizon. A queen cast in metal, while beneath her, buses pass and tourists drift, unaware they are walking through the memory of her fury. But Boudica's legacy is not made of statues alone. It lives in what she represents. She became more than the battles she fought. She became a question, posed to every conqueror, every tyrant, every government that forgets the cost of silence. What happens when the unheard rise? She wasn't perfect. Her war was soaked in blood. Massacres left thousands dead in her wake. Her uprising wasn't clean, and it wasn't quiet. But history doesn't belong to the pure. It's written by those who choose to rise. And rebellion, by its nature, is never tidy. Still, what makes Boudica endure isn't the destruction. It's the fire she lit in the human imagination, a woman who lost everything and still stood tall. A queen who would not be defined by the empire that tried to destroy her. A mother who turned grief into a blade and carried it into war. Modern historians still debate her role, her tactics, her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they won't give you citations. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed. The warrior who united divided tribes. The symbol that showed the world dignity could rise even from ashes. And in that, she is no longer a figure of the past. She becomes something eternal. A banner of rebellion. A spark of courage. A reminder that the will to be free cannot be conquered. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities, redrew its maps, and rewrote its history, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns. In every stand against tyranny, in every voice that dares to say no, and in every soul that chooses to die on their feet rather than live on their knees, Boudica lives on. Her body may be gone, but her legend rides like thunder across the centuries. To the ancients, illness was never just an accident. It wasn't caused by bacteria, viruses, or cellular chaos. Those explanations would come thousands of years later. In the ancient world, disease was a message. It signaled a fracture, not just in the body, but in the balance between mind, soul, nature, and the divine. In Mesopotamia, sickness was divine judgment. If someone fell ill, it was assumed they had angered a god, violated a taboo, or attracted a curse. Diagnosis began not with symptoms, but with suspicion. What did you do? Who did you offend? Priests and healers worked in tandem, deciphering omens, chanting protective spells, and prescribing both rituals and remedies. Healing was part ceremony, part science, part spiritual negotiation. In ancient China, balance was more systematic. Health came from the equilibrium between yin and yang, the harmony of the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. A cough wasn't just a symptom, it was a signal. Practitioners asked when it started, what emotions were felt, what time of day it worsened. Healing meant more than herbs, it meant restoring order within the inner cosmos. Acupuncture, food therapy, and breath work weren't just treatments. They were tools of realignment. In Greece, Hippocrates rejected the idea of divine punishment, but he, too, believed in balance. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, shaped medicine for centuries. Illness was the result of imbalance. And not just physical, temperament and mood were affected, too. A person prone to sorrow was said to have an excess of black bile. Even mental states were treated with dietary changes, bloodletting, or lifestyle adjustments, anything to return the humors to harmony. Across every ancient culture, one thread wove through all the healing practices: health was not just the absence of pain, it was the presence of wholeness. Whether in India's Ayurvedic dashas, Africa's belief in spirit possession, or indigenous traditions where body and land are one, ancient people saw illness as an imbalance of the greater whole. You weren't just a patient, you were a puzzle. A mirror of the universe slightly cracked. And healing meant more than cutting or curing. It meant listening. Listening to the body. Listening to the earth. Listening to what had fallen out of rhythm. In ancient Egypt, where gods walked among mortals and magic bled into medicine, healing was both science and sorcery. Physicians, known as SWNW, were not just doctors. They were spiritual mediators, trained to interpret pain as both physical and cosmic. Ailments were examined alongside dreams. Cures were whispered as prayers. Egyptian medicine was astonishingly advanced. Much of what we know comes from scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BC. It details hundreds of treatments, for everything from headaches to tumors. Egyptian doctors knew how to set bones, stitch wounds, and drain abscesses. They used copper tools, sterilized in fire. They diagnosed illness through observation of pulses, urine, and stool. They recorded treatments with meticulous care, and many of their herbal remedies are still used in some form today. But no healing ever began without ritual. Every herb was gathered with intent. Every treatment was blessed. The gods were always watching. And to heal the body, one had to first honor the spirit within it. So whether in the dusty temples of Thebes, the misty mountains of China, or the windblown plains of Mesopotamia, the message was the same: illness was never just physical. It was a story, a rupture in the harmony between humanity and the world around them. And to cure it, the healer had to mend both flesh and soul. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, was believed to have gifted humanity the knowledge of healing. And then there was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague. Feared and worshipped in equal measure, she could bring epidemics with a breath, or mercy with a glance. To the ancient Egyptians, healing was not a science apart from the sacred. It was magic, ritual, and medicine blended into one. Spells were spoken aloud as herbs were applied, words themselves wielded power. These incantations weren't empty chants. They were sound-made medicine. Among their greatest tools, honey. Long before anyone knew of bacteria, honey was used as a natural antiseptic. It was smeared on wounds, mixed with resin or lint, wrapped in bandages to draw out infection. Garlic and onions were common prescriptions for heart and circulatory health. Castor oil served as a trusted laxative. Even moldy bread was applied to infected wounds, a primitive form of antibiotic centuries ahead of its time. Egyptian physicians treated peasants and pharaohs alike. Their skill was respected far beyond the Nile. Neighboring kingdoms would send for them when illnesses defied explanation. These early healers were specialists, some focused on stomach disorders, others on eye diseases, still others on ailments of the spirit. And they never separated the physical from the divine. A fever might come from a mosquito, or from the wrath of a restless spirit. To heal the body was to balance the cosmos. It meant pleasing the gods, cleansing the soul, and restoring divine harmony. For the Egyptians, a healer's role wasn't simply to mend flesh. It was to realign the universe. Meanwhile, far to the east, another ancient tradition was quietly writing its own story of medicine. Long before modern science, India had Ayurveda, the science of life. More than a medical system, it was a way of living, a philosophy that saw the human body as a mirror of the cosmos, intricately tied to the rhythms of nature and spirit. At its core were the three dashas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, each a blend of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata governed motion, Pitta ruled transformation, like digestion, and Kapha managed structure and stability. Every person was born with a unique balance of these forces. Illness came when that balance was disturbed, by stress, poor diet, environment, or emotional turmoil. Ayurvedic texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita are over 2,000 years old. These ancient manuals didn't just offer herbal cures. They taught surgery, mental health, childbirth, ethics, and preventive care. Charaka emphasized internal medicine and the art of preventing disease before it took root. Sushruta became the father of surgery, detailing over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical tools, many carved from wood, bone, or bronze. One of his most astonishing contributions? Rhinoplasty, rebuilding a nose using skin from the cheek or forehead. Not for vanity. For justice. Often to restore dignity to those disfigured by punishment. Thousands of years before Europe would even imagine such procedures, India had already laid the groundwork. But Ayurveda's strength wasn't just in surgical precision. Its power lay in wholeness. To heal the body, one had to also tend the mind and soul. Treatments were layered: herbal medicine, yoga, breath control, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and spiritual fasting. Plants like turmeric, neem, tulsi, and ashwagandha were more than food, they were sacred allies. They protected the body, calmed the mind, and purified the life force. An Ayurvedic healer might treat a fever not just with herbs, but by aligning your sleep, examining your emotions, and reigniting your digestive fire, Agni. Because true healing, they believed, came not from fighting disease, but from restoring harmony within. Ayurveda teaches a profound truth: you are not separate from nature, you are nature. And when illness takes hold, it is not just a malfunction of the body, but nature's whisper calling you back to balance. In ancient China, health was never confined to muscles, bones, or tissue. It was about energy, qi, pronounced qi, the vital life force that flows through every living being. To be well was to keep that energy moving, unobstructed, steady, and balanced. This idea became the cornerstone of traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, one of the oldest continuously practiced medical systems on Earth. But to understand disease, ancient Chinese physicians first had to understand nature itself. They studied the cycle of seasons, the migration of animals, the waxing and waning of the moon, and the celestial patterns above. From these rhythms emerged two core principles, yin and yang, and the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin and yang represented the duality of existence. Yin was cool, dark, restful, internal. Yang was warm, bright, active, external. Every part of the human body, every emotion, every function, was classified by its yin or yang nature. Health wasn't static, It was a moving balance between these opposites. A fever? Too much yang. Chronic exhaustion? A deficiency in yin. Diagnosis in TCM was a meticulous art form. No high-tech scans, no digital charts, just observation and instinct. A healer would study your tongue's color and texture, feel your pulse in several locations, listen to the pitch of your voice, ask about your emotions, dreams, even your bowel habits. Every detail was a clue in the mystery of your internal balance. To restore that balance, healers drew from a vast toolkit. Acupuncture placed fine needles along meridians, energy highways within the body, to free blocked qi. Moxibustion warmed those same meridians with burning mugwort to stimulate circulation. Cupping, herbal tinctures, qigong breathing exercises, and carefully curated diets were also essential elements of the healing process. All of this was grounded in a foundational text, Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. Compiled over 2,000 years ago, it's still regarded as the bedrock of Chinese medical philosophy. This ancient text didn't just list diseases. It explored their root causes, emphasized preventative care, and linked emotional states, anger, grief, fear, to dysfunction in specific organs. It treated the mind and body as one. In Chinese medicine, there is no clear boundary between the self and the world. The healer's task isn't just to address a physical complaint, but to bring harmony between the person, their environment, and the invisible forces moving within them. Every heartbeat, every breath, was qi speaking, and the physician's role was to listen carefully. Meanwhile, in the stone temples of Greece and the bustling forums of Rome, medicine began to evolve, stepping slowly away from the divine and toward reason and observation. Yet even there, the body was still seen as a delicate ecosystem, governed by balance and internal temperament. At the heart of this view was a theory that would dominate Western thought for over 1,000 years, the four humors. First articulated by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later refined by Roman doctors like Galen, the theory held that four fluids govern human health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to an element, a season, even a personality. Too much black bile. Melancholy. Too much yellow bile? Anger. The key to health was keeping these humors in harmony. Diet, exercise, rest, and even bloodletting were used to restore that balance. Though the tools were different, the core belief was universal: health is not merely the absence of illness. It is the presence of balance, within the body, the soul, and the world surrounding it. Each humor in ancient medicine was linked to an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and to a specific temperament of the human spirit. Health was balance. Illness, nothing more than the result of one fluid rising too high, or another falling too low. A feverish, aggressive patient? Likely burdened with excess yellow bile, too much fire in the system. Someone pale, slow-moving, and withdrawn? That was phlegm, tied to cold and moisture, pulling the body inward. Treatments were designed to restore equilibrium: bloodletting to release heat, purging to remove stagnation, prescribed diets to cool or warm the body, and ritual baths to soothe both body and mind. But ancient Greek medicine didn't stop with fluids. It embraced the idea that the body was a reflection of its environment. Observation mattered. So did setting. The teachings of Hippocrates, echoed today in the physician's oath, urged healers to do no harm, to study the patient fully, not just the symptom. His students were told to consider everything: the season, the wind, the local water supply, even the patient's mood and thoughts. Healing was not isolated. It was contextual. Across Greece, healing sanctuaries named after Asclepius, the god of medicine, were scattered like sacred seeds. These weren't just places for treatment. They were retreats for the soul. Patients would sleep in special dormitories, hoping for divine dreams to guide their recovery. Rituals of purification, gentle exercise, dietary change, and prayer were woven into the healing process. It was a world where logic and mysticism lived side by side. In Rome, medicine advanced further through Galen, a Greek physician whose influence would span centuries. He served gladiators and emperors alike. Through animal dissections, he charted the inner landscape of anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped formalize humor theory across the empire. Some of Galen's ideas would prove flawed. But his belief that the body was a knowable system pushed Greco-Roman medicine toward a new frontier. Healing, once solely the realm of gods, was now the domain of scholars, of observation, and of hands trained in the careful art of restoration. Yet even before schools of medicine or written texts, indigenous healers around the world were already tending their people. Their knowledge was deep, not in books, but in memory. Passed down through dreams, stories, and lived experience in the rhythms of nature. For them, medicine wasn't a job. It was life. Embedded in the turning of seasons, in daily ritual, and in sacred ceremony. Among Native American peoples, healers were known as medicine men and women, but they were more than that. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, dream interpreters, and protectors of ancestral memory. Illness wasn't just biological, it was relational. A disruption between the person and the world around them, nature, tribe, spirit, or even the self. True healing meant more than removing pain. It meant reconnection. Plants played a central role. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, tribes held vast, intricate knowledge of the earth. They knew which root to chew for pain, which bark to crush for wounds, which leaves to steep for fever. Sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco were sacred allies. Burned in smudging ceremonies, they didn't just purify air, they cleansed spirit. But medicine wasn't just in the herb. It was in the intention, the ritual, the respect. Healers often worked with spiritual forces, performing sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Illness could come from a breach of taboos, from ancestral unrest, or from soul loss, a condition where trauma caused the peace of the person's spirit to vanish. In such cases, healing became ceremony. Soul retrieval rituals were held, calling the missing spirit home through song, through movement, through trance. The goal wasn't simply survival. It was restoration. Wholeness. Harmony. A deep reverence for nature pulses through indigenous traditions across the world. In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, shamans work with sacred plant medicines, none more famous than ayahuasca, a powerful hallucinogenic brew. But its purpose is not escape, it is insight. The shamans believe that the plants are conscious teachers. They revealed the roots of suffering through visions, guiding the soul back to harmony. Across the vast terrain of Aboriginal Australia, healing comes through bush medicine, herbs, clays, smoke rituals, and stories passed down through the Dreamtime, the mythic era where ancestors walked the earth. Here, healing is not just about the body. It's about restoring balance between land, lineage, spirit, and song lines, those invisible threads that connect people to the land and each other. These healing systems were never written in books. They lived in footsteps, dances, stories, and sacred sites. To indigenous healers, modern medicine may wield machines and microscopes, but the earth has always been the original pharmacy. And healing? It's not just about curing disease. It's about remembering who we are. Across all ancient civilizations, regardless of continent, climate, or belief system, one truth endured: healing required more than herbs and scalpels. It required spirit. Whether illness was understood as a divine punishment, a soul out of alignment, or a rupture with sacred order, people believed true healing began in the invisible realm. And the path to that realm was ritual. In Mesopotamia, long before hospitals or hand-washing, people turned to priests and exorcists to confront sickness. Diseases were believed to come from angry gods or demonic forces. Healing rites were carved into clay tablets, rituals where prayers were whispered as poultices were placed. Figurines were buried beneath thresholds to repel illness. The ritual was the remedy. In ancient Egypt, medicine blended science with sanctity. No healer worked without first invoking the gods. Before applying honey to a wound or wrapping a splint, a physician would recite prayers to Thoth, god of wisdom, or Sekhmet, fierce goddess of healing and divine wrath. Illness was never just physical, it was cosmic. And healing meant restoring Mat, the sacred principle of harmony, justice, and truth. Across Africa, traditional healers, Ngangas, Sangomas, carried the weight of generations. They beat drums, danced through smoke, cast bones, and spoke with the ancestors. They entered trance-like states to walk the spirit world, asking questions on behalf of the sick. Herbs mattered. But no treatment began without first consulting the unseen. Even in classical Greece, where logic began to challenge myth, rituals still endured. In the sacred temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, patients fasted, purified themselves, and prayed. At night, they slept in the enkoemesis, the dream chamber, beneath the carved stone gaze of the god. Their dreams were then interpreted by priests, who shaped their treatment based on the divine messages received. To the ancient world, ritual was not superstition. It was structure. It turned suffering into symbol, pain into process. It created a map through the wilderness of illness. And in that act of meaning-making, it gave people something more powerful than medicine: hope. Through symbolic gestures, the sick could reclaim dignity. Ritual reminded them they were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a story, shared, sacred, and guided. It stitched human experience into something larger than the body. Even today, modern science studies the placebo effect, the neurological impact of belief, and the healing power of intention. The ancients didn't need the data. They already knew. Sometimes, a single word spoken with reverence can cut deeper than any scalpel, and heal more profoundly than any medicine. Because not all wounds are visible, and not all cures come in bottles. When we imagine ancient surgery, we often picture crude tools, shaky hands, and unbearable pain. But the truth is far more impressive, and more deeply human. Across the ancient world, surgery was practiced with astonishing precision. These early healers didn't have access to anesthesia, imaging technology, or antiseptics. What they had was experience, determination, and a knowledge of the body earned through generations of careful observation, trial, and necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written more than 2,000 years ago, outlined over 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is often regarded as the father of surgery. He described techniques for removing tumors, setting broken bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, a remarkably early form of plastic surgery. His surgical tools were diverse and deliberately crafted: scalpels, forceps, probes, and needles, many forged from iron or carved from stone. Sushruta emphasized more than cutting, he preached preparation. Hygiene, dissection, mostly of animals, and a deep understanding of anatomy were essential. His teachings would ripple outward, eventually influencing medical traditions in the Islamic world and medieval Europe. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge was intertwined with ritual. Medical papyri describe procedures for stitching wounds, treating fractures, and draining abscesses. Bronze knives, bone saws, and heated rods for cauterization have been discovered in tombs, tools once held by hands that walked the line between science and ceremony. They even practiced trepanation, cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head trauma. Remarkably, many of these skulls show signs of healing, evidence that patients lived long after the procedure. And Egypt was not alone. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of trypan skulls, many from warriors wounded in battle. Some regions recorded survival rates as high as 80%, based on evidence of bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used coca leaves to numb pain, or maize beer to sedate. Antiseptics came from the forests, plants with antibacterial power long before the term germ existed. Meanwhile, in the Greco-Roman world, Galen built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge. Studying wounded gladiators and dissecting animals, he mapped nerves, blood vessels, and organs with startling accuracy. His writings became medical doctrine for centuries. Roman military doctors carried his teachings to the battlefield. With speed and skill, they used clamps, cautery, and ligatures to treat wounds under fire. Surgery was risky, but it was respected, reserved for those bold enough to open the body in pursuit of healing, not harm. These were not butchers. They were artists of the blade. And though their knowledge was incomplete, their legacy endures in every sterile scalpel raised today to save, to mend, to give hope. Now we live in a world of robotic arms, real-time diagnostics, and genetic therapy. We skin organs with light. You'll find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas on pharmacy shelves, indigenous smudging ceremonies held in modern hospitals, honoring the traditions of those being healed. Medical students still take an oath, not unlike the one Hippocrates gave, to first do no harm. In operating theaters, surgeons wield precision instruments whose ancestry can be traced back to Sushruta's iron tools. Concepts like holistic care, preventive treatment, and the mind-body connection, now pillars of modern integrative health, are rooted in ancient traditions that saw healing not as a mechanical fix, but as a sacred relationship. Because in every age, and in every corner of the world, healing has never been just a procedure. It has always been a promise. Modern science, in many ways, has come full circle. What the ancients intuited through experience, we now confirm through data, that stress, loneliness, and emotional trauma can break the body's rhythm. They can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep cycles, and manifest as chronic pain. Meditation, once practiced in temples and caves, is now studied under MRI scanners for its impact on the brain. Forest bathing, born from Shinto and indigenous traditions, is prescribed by doctors for anxiety relief. And the placebo effect, once shrugged off as a trick of the mind, now confounds researchers with its measurable power to heal through belief alone. It's easy to dismiss ancient medicine as obsolete, just superstition, folklore, or educated guessing. But when we look closer, we find something far more profound. A worldview that saw illness not simply as a broken machine, but as a fracture in the harmony of being. A sign that something, somewhere, was no longer aligned. And that idea still matters. Because medicine is not just about fixing. It's about meaning. It's about offering comfort, recognizing suffering, and restoring a sense of wholeness. The ancients may not have had microscopes, but they understood something we often forget, that healing is sacred. Whether they used chants, needles, herbs, or knives, they weren't just treating bodies. They were caring for souls. Now, as we race forward into an era of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not abandoning the old ways. Perhaps we are returning to them, with better tools, but the same essential heart. A heart that still longs for balance, for wholeness, for healing, not just of the body, but of the spirit. Her name drifts through the centuries like a song half remembered. Sappho, a poet from the island of Lesbos, born around 630 BC, whose words once stirred listeners beneath moonlit skies, and whose fragments still echo with tenderness and desire. Unlike the warriors and rulers of ancient Greece, Sappho's power didn't come from battle or crown, but from emotion. Her territory was not the battlefield, but the human heart. She wrote of love and jealousy, of beauty and longing, of joy so sharp it ached, and sorrow so gentle it lingered. She captured the smallest moments, a glance, a blush, a heartbeat, and wrapped them in verse like pressed flowers, delicate, fleeting, and immortal. We know little about her life. No portraits. No journals. Just traces. A few precious lines preserved by ancient scholars, embedded in other texts, or salvaged from weathered papyrus. And yet these scraps still shimmer with life. Plato called her the 10th muse. Long after her voice fell silent, poets and translators would chase her memory, trying to reconstruct her legacy from fragments, like a melody half-heard through fog. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island rich in music and learning, where poetry wasn't a performance, it was part of life. She may have had siblings. A daughter. Perhaps even political enemies. The records are cloudy. She endured exile and unrest. Moments of silence. Moments of song. In a world where most women's voices were hushed behind closed doors, Sappho's voice rose, clear, emotional, defiant. Not through rebellion, but through beauty. She wrote in the Iaulic dialect, composing short, lyrical pieces meant to be sung with the lyre. Her poetry was intimate, richly textured, filled with luminous imagery. Evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered. These words have outlived empires. And then, as quietly as she had entered the historical record, she slipped away. Much of her work vanished, lost to fire, decay, or deliberate erasure. But what remains tells us something simple and eternal. She didn't need monuments carved from stone. Her poems were her monuments. Today, when we speak of passion in verse, of love unashamed, of longing that survives centuries, we are still, in some quiet way, whispering the name Sappho. To understand Sappho, one must first understand Lesbos, the island that carried her voice like a song on the wind. Lesbos was no forgotten outpost. In the world of ancient Greece, it flourished as a center of music, poetry, and philosophy. With rolling valleys, silver olive groves, and sea breezes perfumed with salt and wildflowers, Lesbos was more than just beautiful, it was alive with culture. It wasn't Athens. It didn't need to be. It moved to its own rhythm, gentler, more intimate, and steeped in the cadence of the lyre. On Lesbos, music wasn't background noise. It was sacred. The sound of lyres and flutes filled both hearth and temple. Poetry wasn't read, it was sung, and it was felt. From this fertile soil of sound and spirit, Sappho's voice emerged. She lived in the city of Mytilene, the island's vibrant heart. There, politics pulsed through the streets, and artistic energy bloomed like spring. Poets, thinkers, rival clans, and shifting alliances shaped daily life. Even Sappho herself faced exile, perhaps to Sicily, during a time of upheaval. But always, it was Lesbos that called her home. Because Lesbos was more than birthplace, it was muse. It was also a rare haven for female community in a world built by and for men. On this island, daughters of noble families were taught music, poetry, and sacred rites. Some scholars believe Sappho led a thyasos, a kind of school or circle where young women learned lyric art, ritual, and devotion to Aphrodite. It was not a classroom. It was a sanctuary, a sisterhood where emotion and intellect intertwined. In this space, bonds were forged that were emotional, poetic, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote to these women not as distant ideals, but as living souls. She called them by name. She mourned their absences. She celebrated their beauty. and she confessed her love with a rawness that still stirs hearts. In one surviving fragment she pleads, "I have not had one word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me." These were not words pulled from myth. They rose from real experience, of women sitting by oil lamps, singing, weaving, weeping, remembering. Over time, Sappho's legacy would be warped, questioned, and censored, framed by scandal, reduced by speculation. But the truth of her work was born from Lesbos. A place not just on the map, but in the heart. A place where art, intimacy, and womanhood could coexist, uninhibited. Sappho didn't just live on Lesbos. She became it. Its pulse, its voice, its breath. In an era where Homeric epics glorified war and gods, where scrolls were filled with battles and male heroes, Sappho turned inward. She wrote not of bloodshed, but of the trembling hand, the stolen glance, the sound of a voice that stirred the body into shivers. She was one of the first poets in the Western world to say I, not merely to narrate, but to feel. And what she felt was love, jealousy, yearning, delight, ache. And most revolutionary of all, she wrote as a woman to women, about women. In ancient Greece, a woman's voice was often limited to the walls of the home, or silenced entirely. Public speech, literature, philosophy, these were male domains. But Sappho didn't ask for entry. She didn't rebel. She created her own space, with rhythm and melody as her doorway. Her poetry did not shout. It sang. It didn't demand permission. It made its own sanctuary, quiet, intimate, luminous. A universe where emotion was not shameful, but sacred. Where vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. And within the small, sacred space she carved for herself, Sappho did something quietly radical. She named the women she loved. She didn't veil them in vague metaphors or reduce them to symbols. She spoke of their laughter, their perfume, the way they braided their hair. Her language was direct yet tender, reverent without abstraction. In one surviving fragment, she captures a moment of unbearable beauty and quiet pain. He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you, who listens to your sweet voice and watches your lovely laughter. Oh, it makes my heart beat fast. Here, Sappho is not the beloved, but the observer, watching, aching. Her jealousy is silent, dignified, utterly human. With just a few lines, she gives voice to the raw ache of unrequited love, a feeling that still resonates across cultures and centuries. Her words carry desire, but never vulgarity. She wrote sensuality like a painter rendering light, the curve of a neck, the hush of sleep, the shimmer of moonlight across bare skin. For her, intimacy and beauty were inseparable. Because of this, later centuries often misunderstood her. Some erased her queerness. Others reframed her sorrow into convenient tragedy. But no distortion could erase the truth of her voice, a woman writing about love not as an idea, but as someone who had lived it, deeply, openly, and without shame. Sappho wasn't just a poet. She was a composer of the soul's music. Her poems were never intended for silent reading, they were meant to be heard, to be felt. In ancient Greece, poetry was not just language, it was breath, song, vibration. Sappho wrote in the form of the lyric, short, emotionally charged verses performed with a lyre, a small stringed instrument cradled gently in the lap, its notes plucked like petals falling into silence. This was the root of lyric poetry. It is from her form that the word lyrical was born. Unlike the grand epics of heroes and gods, lyric poetry was personal. It didn't speak of wars or fate, it whispered of desire, of memory, of love letters sung beneath fig trees or in firelit rooms. And Sappho was its unrivaled master. She wrote in Aeolic Greek, a dialect full of softness and rhythm. Her favorite form, now known as the Sapphic stanza, flowed with a unique cadence, 3 long, flowing lines followed by one short, breath-like sigh. The structure mirrored the rhythm of emotion itself, rising, falling, pausing in reverent silence. She likely performed these pieces surrounded by women, students, companions, perhaps priestesses. These gatherings, whether educational or ritual in nature, were sanctuaries of freedom, spaces where song, emotion, and the body were not divided but united. Through these shared moments, Sappho didn't just compose poems. She cultivated a culture, an oral lineage of expression, vulnerability, and creation. We can only imagine the sound of her world, the gentle strum of strings, the clear rise of her voice, the breathless stillness of listeners drawn in, word by word. Many of her poems don't begin with declarations, but with questions, with invocations. Like the opening of a conversation, or a prayer offered at dusk, "Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care." Her verses reach both outward to the gods and inward to desire. And though they were written more than 2,000 years ago, they feel astonishingly modern. Set them to music today, and they would still stir something visceral and alive. Sappho transformed poetry into song, and in doing so, she taught us that emotion itself is music. That every heartache, every thrill of touch, every tremble of voice, carries its own melody. And hers is a melody still echoing, soft and eternal, across the ages. For every surviving line of Sappho's poetry, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, that have vanished. What remains are fragments, shards of sound and feeling, words torn from their songs and left to drift across time like petals on the wind. Some come to us as full stanzas. Others are no more than murmurs, a word, a breath, a glimpse of longing, or the end of a thought without its beginning. And yet, even in these slivers, something vital lives on. They glow faintly, like embers in the ashes of something once incandescent. Why did so much disappear? Time, yes. War, certainly. But also deliberate erasure. Once, Sappho's poetry filled 9 volumes, carefully collected, organized, and shelved in the great library of Alexandria. Her verses were copied and performed across the ancient world. But when that library fell, so too did much of humanity's early voice. As the influence of Christianity spread, works seen as pagan, or worse, immoral, were suppressed, neglected, or burned outright. Sappho's poetry, rich with passion and clear in its depictions of same-sex love, became a target. By the medieval era, her name lingered, but her voice had nearly been silenced. It is only through scattered quotations, preserved in grammar books, commentaries, and philosophical texts, that pieces of her survived. Her words were often cited for their technical brilliance or unusual phrasing, not for the aching beauty that lived within them. And yet, the emotion seeped through. Then came the sand. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists digging through the dry soil of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt uncovered thousands of ancient manuscript fragments. Among them, faded, torn lines of Sappho, verses hidden for over a millennium. More discoveries followed. In 2004, a nearly complete poem surfaced on a papyrus once wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Every rediscovered line felt like a heartbeat returning, like a breath pulled back from oblivion. And yet so much remains lost. Today, we read Sappho in echoes. What we long for is not only what she said, but what she might have said, if only time had left her uninterrupted. Still, there is something hauntingly poetic in this survival through fragments. After all, Sappho herself wrote about impermanence, about beauty vanishing like smoke, about moments slipping through fingers like silk. Perhaps it is fitting that her work comes to us not as a statue, but as a mystery, scattered pieces gathered by those who still love language, music, and the intimate tremble of the human heart. A voice once nearly extinguished by fire, still burning. Sappho's poetry was too honest to escape scrutiny. In her lifetime, she was revered, praised as a master of lyricism. Plato called her the 10th muse, a mortal among gods. But as the centuries unfolded, her legacy was reshaped, distorted, and, at times, buried under the discomfort of later cultures. Why? Because she wrote of love, not the kind history was eager to remember. Her verses speak unabashedly of affection and longing between women. She praised their beauty, mourned their departures, confessed jealousy, and rejoiced in their closeness. Her poetry was not coded or veiled, it was luminous, and that luminosity both illuminated and scandalized the world that followed. In Sappho's world, this was not strange. On the island of Lesbos, particularly among aristocratic women, deep emotional and even romantic bonds were not only accepted, they were celebrated. Love, affection, and tenderness between women flourished in circles of learning and artistry. But centuries later, new cultures with different values arrived, Roman, Christian, Victorian, and they struggled with what Sappho had left behind. Rather than confront her truth, they rewrote her story. Medieval scribes ignored her entirely. Renaissance translators softened her words. The Victorians, uncomfortable with the clarity of her desire, reimagined her as a tragic figure pining for a man. They even invented a myth that she leapt to her death from a cliff for the love of a ferryman named Phaon, a story that appears nowhere in her own writings. This fiction had a purpose. It sanitized her, straightened her, made her safe. It reframed her longing as a woman's acceptable grief over a man, rather than a bold expression of queer love. Some critics tried to rebrand her work as merely educational. Others dismissed it as improper. And yet Sappho endured. Even in the shadows of scandal and censorship, her name refused to vanish. By the 19th century, when open conversations about same-sex love were taboo, Sappho's legacy became a quiet symbol of queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian entered the language, rooted in her name and her island. Without intending to, she became a figure of resistance. A poetic ancestor for generations whose loves had been silenced. A voice echoing through coded verses and whispered admiration. And still today, the questions linger. Who was she really? A teacher? A lover? A myth? A threat? Perhaps the better question is, why are we still afraid of her truth? Sappho never wrote to conform. She wrote what she felt. She named her longing, honored beauty, and transformed personal ache into public art. Her scandal was not in her love, it was in her honesty. She dared to write desire without apology. And history tried to muffle her, but it never could. If one divine presence hovered over Sappho's work, it was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible yearning. To Sappho, Aphrodite was not a distant deity. She was a muse, a confidant, perhaps even a companion. In her most powerful verses, Sappho doesn't just describe love, she prays to it. Her poems become invocations, cries for help when longing grew unbearable. In her most famous surviving work, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho doesn't flatter. She pleads, "Come to me now. If ever you have answered my voice in the past, free me from hard care. Fulfill all that my heart longs to achieve. There is no shame in this vulnerability. No fear in speaking her desire aloud." For Sappho, love was never sinful. It was divine. A sacred force strong enough to call down a goddess. In the ancient world, Aphrodite was more than a symbol of romance. She ruled over seduction, magnetism, and the mysteries of attraction. She governed both the sweetness of union and the sting of separation. To call her name was to acknowledge that love can wound just as deeply as it heals. Sappho knew that duality well. She didn't idealize love, she lived inside its contradictions. She wrote of its sweetness and its cruelty, its gentleness and its violence. In one haunting verse, she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain, troubling the oak trees." Here, love isn't a gentle breeze, it's a force of nature. It tears through you. It uproots you. And it never asks permission. By placing Aphrodite at the center of her emotional world, Sappho transformed longing into something mythic. Her verses dissolved the boundaries between personal emotion and divine presence, between the pulse of a human heart and the movements of cosmic force. In doing so, she shaped a literary tradition where love was not merely a subject. It was sacred practice, a form of worship. For Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't a distant goddess carved in marble. She was a mirror, a force reflecting back the tangle of love, confusion, awe, and beauty inside every human soul. In Sappho's verse, the goddess listens, and sometimes she answers. But like her poetry, Sappho's death is a mystery, wrapped in myth. No one truly knows when she died, how old she was, or where she spent her final days. Some say she passed peacefully on Lesbos, the island of her birth, surrounded by sea winds and the songs she loved. Others, especially Roman poets centuries later, wove tragic tales. They imagined her leaping from the white cliffs of Lefkada, driven to despair by an unrequited love for a beautiful ferryman named Phaon. But there is no evidence for that story. It reads more like invention, a convenient ending written by men who needed to reshape her truth into something more familiar. A woman loving women was too difficult for some to accept, so her life was rewritten as a heterosexual tragedy. Clean, contained, but false. The truth is quieter and more powerful. Sappho faded the way she arrived, subtly, surrounded by lyric. After her death, her name lived on for centuries. She was read by philosophers, quoted by playwrights, and sung in theaters throughout the Greek world. Her poems were collected into 9 books, a treasury of lyric expression. At one time, her fame rivaled Homer's. But history has never been kind to voices that defy its comfort. As Rome rose, and later as Christian ideology swept across Europe, Sappho's emotionally intimate, sensually charged poems, especially those expressing female love, were deemed dangerous. Her work stopped being copied. Her volumes were left to rot in libraries that burned or fell to dust. Some believe her poetry was purposefully destroyed by early church leaders who feared the power of her voice. By the Middle Ages, only her name remained. Her words mostly vanished. And yet Sappho would not stay lost. Over 1,000 years later, fragments began to reappear, unearthed from forgotten Egyptian garbage heaps or quoted by ancient grammarians. Line by line she returned. Not through legend, but through survival. Her death may be hidden by time, but her disappearance was never complete. She endured in whispers, scribbled in margins, spoken from memory, carried forward by those who refused to let her fade. Sappho didn't need a heroic death. Her poems had already made her immortal. And in the quiet spaces where her full voice once sang, we still feel her presence, aching, unfinished, but never truly gone. Sappho's life may rest in shadows, her verses scattered, her biography incomplete, but her influence has only grown stronger with each passing century. Like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out, her light has endured. In every era, someone finds her again. During the Renaissance, scholars pored over her surviving lines, marveling at her ability to make raw emotion feel like music. They recognized not just a poet, but a timeless soul, one who knew how to write not about the gods above, but about the sacred tremors within. During the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley evoked her name with awe. By the 19th and 20th centuries, as conversations around gender, identity, An expression began to stir once more. Sappho reemerged, this time as a symbol of queer endurance, of feminine creativity, of emotional liberation. Her name found a second life not just in literature, but in language itself. Sapphic used to describe romantic love between women. Lesbian, drawn from the very island where she once sang, now carried by millions as a global identity. These words are more than terms. They are echoes. Echoes of her voice, her longing, her defiance. Proof that a single voice, clear and unashamed, can ripple across centuries and still reshape the way we understand love, identity, and the power of emotion. Artists, writers, and musicians remain magnetically drawn to her. Painters have imagined her at twilight, lyre in hand, bathed in moonlight. Poets continue to translate her, generation after generation, each version seeking the breath behind the fragments, the heartbeat behind the syllables. Modern authors reimagine her life, reclaim her story, and resurrect her spirit through novels, songs, and plays. Through all of it, one truth remains. Sappho speaks to something eternal. It doesn't matter that her verses are incomplete. It doesn't matter that the details of her life have blurred through time. What matters is what burns beneath the lines, the trembling joy of desire, the ache of absence, the holiness of beauty itself. These are not ancient emotions. They are ours. They are now. She simply found a way to sing them. Perhaps this is Sappho's true immortality, not carved in statues or tucked into academic footnotes, but in the breathless pause her words still create. The way a line from 2,500 years ago can halt a reader mid-sentence, make them look up from the page, and feel understood. Sappho's greatest gift was never just poetry. It was presence. She made feeling itself a form of art. She transformed yearning into a kind of truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror, for anyone who has ever loved quietly, or fiercely, or against the tide of the world. And as long as hearts continue to break and mend through the power of words, Sappho will remain, not only remembered, but felt.